Good morning, and thank you for joining me. I would like to start a brand new series this week called The Historical Jesus. I'd like to give a little bit of background on why this is such an important matter to me and to many others, and why it is something that everyone has to consider at least to some degree. Now, I grew up in the Pentecostal church, and eventually we kind of migrated into charismatic church, and I became a pastor in 2004. I spent the next 18 to 20 years pastoring a traditional church. But I remember growing up as a child, the most important question you could ever be asked is, do you know Jesus? I mean, we literally went out onto the streets with tracts, and this was the question we would ask perfect strangers who were often drunk on the Durban beachfront. This was the most important question to us. And any Christian of that era, and today still, I guess, and especially young kids like us, when this question was asked and put to us, we would immediately respond with an unresounding, yes, we know Jesus, because we believe that on that statement hung our eternal salvation, or torment for that matter. And it was only really much later in my life that I started realizing that this is a little bit of an unfair question. How was it possible to actually know someone who lived 2,000 years ago? And the answer to that, of course, was to most charismatics very simple. Well, you must talk to Jesus, and he's going to talk back to you, and you'll have a personal relationship with him. And even though I bought into that for a very long time, that also I started understanding this also as a bit of a stretch. I came to the realization about 10 years or so ago that the only way we can really know Jesus is by what we have written down of him. In other words, through his words, the red letter words, as they're called. In the very same way that if I ask you, how will you ever know Benjamin Franklin? Do you know Benjamin Franklin? The reality is it's impossible to know him. And the only way to get to know him to some degree, far from a personal relationship, is to read some of the things that he had penned down. So I came to this conclusion that this is one of the reasons why the Bible, and specifically the Gospels, are very important to us as church people, because in them we have really the only tools we have to ever kind of get to know Jesus. Now, of course, there were many subjective experiences had by many, visions, dreams. I have aunties who believe Jesus comes and sits next to them and dances with them in the mornings. But often many of those experiences, they're subjective. They've got to do more with an impression within the inside. It's a matter of conscience, or the subconscious, conscience speaking, or raising questions, or giving answers. Always subjective, and it's impossible to live your life by others' subjective experiences of Jesus. The only really concrete thing we do have is what's been penned down for us. And of course, this is in the Reformation. This was incredibly important to the church, so that sola scriptura, only scripture, became an absolute pillar of the Protestant movement. So the problem comes in when you start realizing that the words of Jesus we do have penned down might not be his actual contextual words. And so this is what the story of, or the quest for the historical Jesus is kind of about. It's about realizing that our idea of Jesus as a modern 21st century Western people might not be correctly aligned with what Jesus might have actually thought, actually done, etc., etc. We very much rely on many layers throughout the centuries and now millennia of interpretation of what he has done and how he has done it. We tell ourselves stories that become normal. We normalize, for instance, the harmonization of the Gospels, something we just do almost instinctively. I'm not going to give any examples right now. That's for the later sessions. But once you realize that we have interpreted Jesus for many, many years, we've told stories about him for many millennia, and we've harmonized the Gospels. And I think this is the thing that really hit me, is I realized through reading books by people who ask the hard and uncomfortable questions, I've been harmonizing the Gospels. And once you stop harmonizing the Gospels, in other words, making them all make sense together as one unit, you realize that they often say contradictory things, things that are very hard to reconcile, and in many ways they offer a portrait of Jesus, for instance, the difference between Mark and John, that really can't both go back to the historical Jesus. And then you have a dilemma. The dilemma is this: how do I know Jesus? And do I know Jesus? Because my knowledge of Jesus is based on a harmonization of the Gospels, which I believe now to be incorrect. So, around the end of the 18th century, there were some German Enlightenment scholars who started asking the very hard and very difficult questions about the Gospels and about the historical Jesus. I've read a bit of Albert Schweitzer's work in 1906, who summarizes the century before him, of all these scholars, what they said, what they thought, the price many of them paid for taking this critical stance to the Gospels. Many of them lost their jobs, their positions at universities, etc., because for the first time people were also allowed to do this. They started asking the hard, uncomfortable questions, simple things like, why do we have two completely different virgin birth stories, etc. People didn't like it, but out of this was born a discipline called the quest for the historic Jesus. And this has been going on for about the last 250 years. And basically what it is people asking the hard and uncomfortable questions from the Gospels, trying to decipher or look at, can we find something that goes back, or let me rather say, what goes back to the historical Jesus and what doesn't. As you might very well know, context is everything when we read literature. And so, in that way, if I can just give a quick example, in Luke, Jesus said, blessed are the poor and woe to the rich. It's a bit of a weird statement. It doesn't really fit our modern prosperity gospel charismatic thrust, in which we believe Jesus wants to make us rich. It actually is the opposite of what he actually said. And in that, you have already just a very simple example of how the Jesus we have in our brains right now, and the one that actually possibly walked the earth, might be a little bit different. And it's not that he has changed, it's our perspective, our theologizing about him, our interpretation of what he said changed over all this time. The reality is just that we interpret things according to our very own context, especially when we're reading or promoting theology. So one of the things that these early scholars of the historical Jesus assumed is that they assumed that the Gospels themselves already carried for us an interpretation of Jesus, and this is the reason why they're so often very, very different. And so the quest for the historical Jesus is the process. It's a literary discipline, a historical discipline, in which we try and see, if Jesus here says, blessed are the poor in spirit, and here he says, blessed are the poor, which one is more likely to actually have come from Jesus? And there are many ways and many tools that have been developed over the last 250 years in order to do these type of things, and we'll get to them in due time. So the real question I had to ask myself is, do I really know what Jesus was like? And would I be comfortable if Jesus, for instance, let me give you another really big trigger point, if Jesus never really abolished the law and actually was a law-abiding citizen himself? When I say law here, I mean the commandments. Because in much of the charismatic movement, it's understood that Jesus actually abolished the law and made an end to the law. And this is not what we get once we start investigating the historical Jesus. It's very much a later interpretation of his life and his works and his teachings in a later context, which is a context against the Jews and the law. All right. So I've written an article, The Jesus I Was Never Taught, and that's on Substack, and that came out on Sunday. That covers more or less what I've said now, plus a little bit of more detail about the 250 years, which scholars were involved in this process, the landmark works. And so I've mentioned Albert Schweitzer in 1906, who wrote kind of like a summary of those who had gone before him. But the work that I would like to focus on in this series is the work by E.P. Sanders called The Historical Figure. Let me just get so there's so much information here, I need to read some of it. The Historical Figure of Jesus, published in 1993. This is one of the landmark works on the historical Jesus. It's very close to our own time, about 30 years ago. And it builds on all of this work done over the last 200 years. And is really one that I felt when I read this, that this really gives us our best guess at this point. And there's been some development after that, but not much on top of this. When I read E.P. Sanders, it seems like 95% of it agrees with most of the critical scholarship today, which I've also read. And this one is written in such a way that it's easier to understand, nice to follow. And so I've chosen this work from 1993 to summarize and discuss in these next following sessions. And I would encourage you to get the book yourself, if you like. It's available on Amazon.com, and to read it on your own, if you like. That definitely going to benefit you. And so one of the things that E.P. Sanders is remembered for, he's late now, he's passed away quite recently, I think, is that he placed Jesus in his Jewish context. And this is incredibly important. This is what historians do. They look at the context of a person and try and make sense of what the person says in terms of their context. What I do like about E.P. Sanders is that he structures really, really well. He tells you when he's not sure, and he tells you when he's rather sure that this did or did not happen. And so I want to remind you that we're always dealing with probabilities when we're going back in history, because it's not a kind of like a repeatable experiment. We can't repeat it like in science to prove that it is or is not. But we have to rely on probabilities in these various cases. All right, that's my little introduction for what we're about to do. And some of this is going to be history. Some of it's going to be from the Bible, of course. It's gonna help you. It's going to enrich you, but it's also going to really, really challenge you. There are some things in our Gospels that are the result of theological interpretation that might not go back to the historical Jesus. And I had to ask myself the question, am I really looking to know Jesus? Or am I looking to know the Jesus that was taught to me in Sunday school? And am I kind of willing to accept the discrepancies and wrestle with the discrepancies? And that's why I started reading in this direction about 3 or so years ago, trying to make sense of this. And I feel like I'm starting to get a better grip on what we're really dealing with here. And I hope that this series will also enrich your very own life. All right, so in this first session, and I can't guarantee what we'll get through and what we won't, but I don't want to rush anything. I would like to do just a quick introduction, and then I would like to spend a couple of moments on the political setting of Galilee, Judea, the areas that are important to us when we read the history of Jesus. Now, every single thing that I'm going to be mentioning is, of course, a summary from E.P. Sanders' work. So in many cases, I can't elaborate too much. It's a 300-page book. I've summarized it to 60 pages. So I'm already working with summaries, and I'm hoping that, the reality is just I can't elaborate on everything, but I'd like to at least make you aware. As someone, let's say, someone watching this is never going to read this book, and you're never actually going to read any books on the historical Jesus. It's too uncomfortable. It's too... some of it's scholarly work. They use words that's not part of our lay language. So my duty, my task here, and my passion really here, is to try and make this as easy as possible. But there's a trade-off. The easier I make it, the less evidence I provide. The more complicated, the more evidence I like to provide, the more complicated I make it. So I don't expect anyone to take anything I say as correct just because I used to be a pastor. I realize now that it's one of the worst things you can do. But anyway, I'm going to get this out there, and I hope that at least it'll challenge you or enrich you in some way. All right, so we're going to do an introduction and then go to the outline of Jesus' life, and then finally try to see if we can get to the political setting of Galilee, and Judea. All right, so in the introduction, we're not going to be discussing the Christ of Christian creeds from the medieval times, also nor the Christ of the modern charismatics. We're going to be searching for Jesus the human who lived in the first century, and we're going to be looking at him from a historical perspective. We're going to use historical methods, like we are writing about any other figure of history. Now, this is going to be slightly offensive because people I don't like Jesus to be treated like any other person in history. But in order to get to the history of his life, we have to, all right? We'll push aside the urge to look at Jesus as arguably the most important person who ever lived in Western history, which I believe to be true. But we have to put those things aside to get to the man. And we're going to be looking at him on the basis of historical grounds. We're not going to be theologizing about him, who he was, and how his life intersects with divinity. That's outside of our scope. But we will be looking at the theology we believe he could have had. We're going to resist to try and square this off or square off all these ideas with later Christian dogma. If you don't know what later Christian dogma is, it's everything that came after the Gospels, the interpolation, the extrapolation of the Gospels. We are taking a historical approach. Okay, so obviously we will be primarily focusing on the Gospels. They are, in fact, our best sources for the life and the teaching of Jesus. But unfortunately, they leave much to be desired. Otherwise, I would just be sitting here telling you, go read Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. It's not that simple. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. The Gospels report Jesus' sayings and actions in a language that was not his own, placing each piece of information in a setting that was devised by his followers at least one generation removed from the actual events. And even if we assume we have the actual exact verbatim words, most of the time they are quoted out of context, and we're gonna expand on that a little bit later. It has only been about 250 years since scholars have been allowed to apply literary and historical criticism to the New Testament Gospels. From these disciplines, we realize that we can actually know quite a lot about the life of Jesus. So the good news, if you're already skeptical of this process, the good news is we can actually know a lot about Jesus's life. We can assume that he did live on a very high probability, and there's a lot of events in his life that, according to E.P. Sanders, is historically reliable, right? We can know quite a lot, but we aim to lay out what we can know using standard methods of historical research. And the point of this is to get to a place where when anybody says, well, I believe Jesus lived, then it's not just a belief anymore. It can actually be shown to be highly probable by historical methods. And so you're no longer putting your faith in that Jesus lived based on no evidence, but we're really basing what we believe or what we've come to trust on the evidence that is there, right? But this is a very difficult task. So our primary sources, the Gospels of the New Testament, are widely read, right? And each one reads them according to their own particular theological slant. And that's why we have so many Christian denominations and people have different views of Jesus. A charismatic prosperity teacher's view will not be the same as Mother Teresa's view of Jesus. And the evidence is that they live their lives in very different ways. People want to agree with Jesus, and this has the reverse effect that often when we read about him, we see him agreeing with our presupposed positions. I can't stress this anymore. This is one of the most important things that I've realized in the way that I've been reading and thinking about Jesus, that in fact, in many ways, I've been making him apply or agree with how I see things. How do we do this? Well, we cherry pick. We only read and emphasize certain portions of his ministry. Number two, we interpret hard sayings. Things that don't agree with us, we reinterpret them until they do. That's just what we do. Pastors are really good at that. Now, Jesus' ethical teachings draw praise from almost all the quarters of society, which speaks to the praise also of the task of the gospel writers. They absolutely succeeded in selling Jesus to the world. But it falls to the lot of the historian to subject the gospels to some hard and rough handling, right? Asking the difficult questions. The historian may not assent to the theology of the Gospels, because we must be aware that the writers had theological convictions and that they might have revised their accounts to support their theology. I know it might be hard for you to accept this, some of you watching, but I really think that this is the case. After it's now been years of researching this, it makes perfect sense, and it seems to be able to show that the gospel writers reinterpreted the events of Jesus' life to fit their particular slant and theology, and they do not always agree. The historian, therefore, must subject even the ethical teaching to that even must suspect then that even the ethical teaching of Jesus has been enhanced, it's been exaggerated, it's been some homiletical use has brought it to the form we have in the Gospels today. The historian must suspect, there's been some editorial improvements and rhetorical exaggerations between the time of Jesus and the publications of the Gospels. Just to remind you, we're talking about 40 to 70 years after the life of Jesus. Many of them written outside of Palestine and in a completely different language. The historian cannot cherry pick the Gospels, and to my own shame, I realized today that in all of my ministry as a pastor, I was cherry picking the Gospels to fit what I believe to be true, right? This is a terrible way to try and find out who Jesus really was. The best way to try and find out who Jesus really was is to take all the sayings together and weigh them against each other, and where there are problems, to try and historically figure those things out. The historian selects on completely different principles. What can be proved, what can be disproved, and what lies in between, in which we can't say much about. All right. So, a quick outline, just a 5-point outline of this entire series will follow the following mission. Number one, we're going to do a historical sketch of the life and the time in which Jesus lived. We're going to do a brief account of the political situation in the first century Palestine. This is incredibly important because it plays into some very important themes within the Gospels. Without this background or historical knowledge, we make it fit something else. We're going to look at Judaism as a religion because this is the religion that Jesus came from. We're also going to do a reconstruction of Jesus's activities, his teachings, his conflicts, and then also finally his death. And as a final little portion, E.P. Sanders did a reflection on the resurrection. And so this is the course we're going to be taking. And let's get in there now. An outline of the life of Jesus. There are no substantial doubts about the general course of Jesus' life. When and where he lived, approximately, when and where he died, and the sort of activities he engaged himself in during his life. Once we go deeper, some things can be called into question, historically. But for now, we stay on the surface. And what I'm going to do now is give you a list of the things that E.P. Sanders is very confident about really happened. In other words, these are, we can call them facts, I guess, but they are events that we historically can prove most likely happened, right? So this is important because this creates like a skeleton of which we have to fill in the flesh. Here they are. I'm going to give them to you in a list form, right? So Jesus was born around 4 BCE at the time of the death of Herod the Great. He spent his childhood and his early adult years in Nazareth. Nazareth was a very small Galilean village. In the series, we'll look at how big was Nazareth, how many people probably lived there, and do a little bit of archaeological work on the small little fishing village in Galilee. The most important thing to know for now, for those of you who are not geographically orientated, Nazareth is in Galilee. Galilee was a region, and Nazareth was a small town on the Sea of Galilee. Oh, sorry, I'm not sure if it's on the Sea of Galilee, but it's in Galilee. Okay, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. We're pretty sure that Jesus called disciples. He taught in towns and villages and the countryside of Galilee. Not so much in the cities of Galilee, because Galilee had big cities. Some of them were Greco-Roman cities, but it doesn't seem like Jesus taught in those cities. He preached the kingdom of God. This is something that seems quite clear, that the central message of Jesus was the kingdom of God. Now, about the year 30, and this is just circa 30 CE, he went to Jerusalem for the Passover. He created some form of a disturbance in the temple in Jerusalem, and then he had a final meal with his disciples. Then he was arrested, and he was interrogated by the Jewish authorities, specifically by the high priest. Then later he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect, who was at that point Pontius Pilate. Sorry, I got a little lizard in my... Hey, don't fall on me, bruv. Oh, shiver it. Okay. Nothing like a gecko going down the back. Okay, he was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. If one of these lizards fall on my head, yeah, guys. Okay, I hope my iPad and my phone survives that. All right. Okay, there are also some things we can be pretty certain about that happened after his death. Right, number one, we know that his disciples ran away. They basically fled at his death. That we also know historically that they saw him. In exactly one sense, we are not 100% certain, and we'll talk about that after his death. We also can be sure that they were quite confident that he would return and found a kingdom here on earth, right? They formed a community as they awaited his return, and they sought to win others to the faith, as he to them was God's Messiah. Now, this list is the list it forms a skeleton of historical, very high probabilities that these are the things that actually happened. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that a position like the mythicist position that says that Jesus never existed is unfortunately not historically provable. We're pretty sure that in fact he did. So we'll discuss most of these items I've listed a little bit later, but now I'd like to read a narrative form of Jesus' life. Now I want you to just, for those of you who've been Christians for a very long time, you might take this a little bit for granted, but I don't want you, because these words are carefully chosen. These are the things we can show, right? This is important. There's a difference between the things we can show to be historically probable and the things we can't. So what you do need to do here is pay careful attention of what is said and what is left out, because what is left out we cannot be 100% sure of, but what is inside of this little narrative is something we could be pretty sure of. So let me read this for you. The year of Jesus' birth is not entirely certain. Most scholars prefer around 4 BCE. Others prefer dates like 5, 6, or even 7 BCE. BCE, of course, is before Common Era. And the reason why Jesus is born before Christ or before Common Era is that Common Era was the invention of a monk in the Mid Ages, in the 6th century, and therefore Jesus' date doesn't align perfectly. But anyway, Jesus lived with his parents in Nazareth. It was a Galilean village. At that time, Antipas, Herod the Great's heir or son, was the ruler of this region called Galilee, right? And he was the ruler for all of Jesus' life. It is a very strong possibility that most of Jesus' life was lived out in Galilee, except for the last maybe 2 to 3 weeks of his life in which he goes down to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not in Galilee. Jerusalem is in Judea to the south, right? For those of you who are geographically challenged. The cities of Galilee, they were big cities, Sephora, Tiberias, and Scythopolis. They don't really feature in the accounts and in Jesus' activities. Jesus mainly directed his mission to the villages, small towns in Galilee, and many of his people were actually fishermen. So this is a very important part of Jesus' life, and we'll go into detail later. He spent his time with small village people. That's where he spent his time. All right. John the Baptist began to preach near Galilee when Jesus was probably around his late 20s. John proclaimed the urgent need to repent in the view of a coming judgment. This is very important for our study. Jesus heard John. He felt the need to accept his baptism. All four of the Gospels point to this event as an event that kicked off Jesus' ministry or transformed Jesus' life. In Mark 1, verse 9 to 11, Mark records for us that at this time there's a voice from heaven saying, "You are my beloved son." Antipas arrested John because John criticized his marriage, or because he feared that John's preaching would lead to an insurrection, or possibly both. At around that time, Jesus then begins his ministry once John kind of disappears. Going from town to town, Jesus goes, not like John. John was always preaching in the outside the settled areas, where Jesus did not start doing that. He went to small villages, specifically he went to the synagogues on Sabbaths. Well, Jesus called a small number of disciples as he traveled. He was healing the sick and he was exorcising demons. John only seemed to have preached. We don't have a record of John healing the sick or exorcising demons, which is interesting, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Soon Jesus started to draw crowds, which forced him to go into more open areas outside the villages and the small towns. We do not know how long Jesus' ministry continued. It was an itinerant ministry. He moved around all the time, but apparently it was about 1 or possibly 2 years. Now, after this period, Jesus and his disciples, they went to Jerusalem for the Passover. Jerusalem was in Judea, and unlike Galilee, it was a Roman province. Now, this is important. Galilee in the north, where Jesus was from, was ruled by the Client king, a Jew by the name of Antipas. He was Herod the Great's son. And so they were semi-independent in that way. Let me not say too much now. We'll get into the detail later. But Jerusalem was not ruled by a Jewish king. This was brand new news to me. But it was actually ruled by the high priest, who reported to the Roman prefect. And in fact, Jerusalem and Judea was part of the Syrian province of the Roman Empire. So there's a big difference between Galilee and Judea. Jesus rode into the city, into Jerusalem, on a donkey, and some there held him a son of David. He went to the temple. He disrupted the money changers and the dove sellers. The high priest and his advisors determined that Jesus was dangerous, and he had to die. After the Passover meal with his disciples, Jesus went to pray while one of his followers betrayed him, and the priest's soldiers arrested him. He was tried and he was turned over to the Roman prefect with a recommendation that he should be executed. After a brief hearing, the prefect ordered his execution. He was crucified as an insurgent along with 2 others. He died after a relatively short period of suffering. A few of his followers placed him in the tomb, according to some reports. When they returned a day or 2 later to anoint his body, they found that the tomb was empty. Thereafter, his followers saw him. These appearances convinced his followers that Jesus would return and that in his life and death, God had acted to save humanity. The disciples began to persuade others to put their trust in Jesus also. They gave him titles later: the Anointed, Messiah, the Lord, and Son of God. The titles indicate that his followers developed various views about Jesus' relation to God, and from his significance and of his significance to Israel, and God's plan then also for the world. This movement finally separated from Judaism and became what is known today as the Christian Church. When the Gospels were written, however, these Christology just means the theological explanation of the person and the work of Jesus. They were at a very early stage, and the separation of Christianity from Judaism was not complete yet. We will try to explain every sentence I've just read in this narrative, some in detail, some not. For now, we turn to the political and the religious conditions of Palestine in that time. Okay, so that was just a summary, basically, of the things we can know quite strongly, with high probability. Oh, my actual hat. Okay. Lizards. The political setting. Now, there was a threefold division of power during this time in the area of interest to us. First, we have Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas was like a Client king. He was a tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. Now, why is this important to us? Because Jesus was from Galilee and spent most of his time in Galilee. Then we have the Roman official, Pontius Pilate. He was a Roman prefect, and he was in charge of Judea. Judea is a different area from Galilee. It's to the south. It includes the areas of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Sorry, pronunciation doesn't come out right, I apologize. Lastly, in our threefold court, we have Joseph Caiaphas. He was the high priest and was stationed in Jerusalem. So we have Herod Antipas in Galilee, we have Pontius Pilate over Judea, and under him we have Caiaphas, Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest, and in Jerusalem. So let's talk about a little bit about the history of this political setting. We take a couple of steps back into the history of the area. Most of our information is taken from Josephus, son of Matthias. He was born into an aristocratic priestly family, commander of Galilee during the revolt against Rome in 66 CE. Later, he became a historical writer in Rome for the Caesar. He published the Jewish War and Jewish Antiquities in 70s CE, and that's where we get more. That's the only information we really have on the Jewish history of that time, and that's where most of our information will come from. You can find this work online and go read it for yourself. If you like, if you want, I can send it to you. It's available in PDF all over the place. It's a lot of reading. So from the 6th century to the 2nd century BCE, the Jews in Palestine were a very small nation within the greatest empires of the earth. They were ruled by their high priest and his council, not by a king. The Jews lived peacefully under the Persians and the Hellenistic kings. But this all changed with the ascent of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Well, he was the ruler of the northern Seleucid Hellenistic Empire, which he inherited from Alexander the Great. And this happened in 175 BCE. Now, his pressure on the Jews towards Hellenization. Now, Hellenization is for the Jews to adopt Greek culture. It became too much for the Jews, and they were forced to eat pork, sacrifice to pagan gods, and the temple was defiled by pagan sacrifices. You can understand why this was a no-no for the Jews, and this obviously led to a massive revolt called the Maccabean Revolt, which was led by the Hasmoneans. This revolt succeeded, and the Jews were independent for about, I think it's about 100 years, until in 63 BCE, the Roman commander, General Pompey, conquered Jerusalem, and from that on forward, Jerusalem was under the rule, of course, of the Romans. But the Romans then appointed a high priest / king and also a military governor whose name was Antipater, whose son eventually would be Herod the Great, and whose son then again would be Antipas, the king in the time of Jesus. So Pompey's invasion altered the status of the Jewish government. It was no longer independent at all, but it was now semi-independent. The new client king had to pay tribute to Rome and support Roman politics and military campaigns. Later, supported by Mark Antony and Augustus, Herod was declared king of Judea by the Roman Senate. Right. A little bit then about Herod the Great, who was kind of like then the first king again, here at the end of the 1st century BCE. Okay. Herod was half Jewish, and he married into the Hasmonean family who overthrew the Seleucids. He feared a revolt, and he ended up killing his wife, Marianne is her name, and also his 2 sons. Quite a dodgy little character. On crucial points, Augustus, obviously, as the Roman emperor, had the last word. But otherwise, Herod was master of his own house. He engaged in many extravagant building schemes. He's one of the great builders of the ancient world. He increased trade, and he ruthlessly suppressed all opposition, even some minor protest. But at the end of his life, he executed all 3 of his sons, or by the end of his life, he had executed all 3 of his sons because he suspected them of treason. Augustus remarked somewhere that he would rather be Herod's pig than his son, for obvious reasons. But on balance, Herod was a good king by the standards of his day. Although not a moral icon, he was lenient compared to Nero and brutal when compared to Augustus. But as long as Jewish Palestine was stable, Rome left it alone. So Herod dies in 4 BCE, and this is a marker for us for the birth of Jesus according to Matthew. Right. But when he dies, his kingdom is divided, right, between his other three sons. Antipas, who is often called Herod in our New Testament, which is not Herod the Great, he is Herod the Great's son, Antipas, so you've got to make that distinction. He inherited Galilee and Perea. Now, Galilee is, of course, important to us because he is ruling as a client king, Galilee. I keep on saying Galilee, sorry, Galilee during the time of Jesus. He ruled well until his death in about 39 CE. Now, his brother Archelaus, he inherited Judea, Samaria, and Idumea, but he was removed by the Romans in 6 CE, and this is an important date for us because there was a census that was called at 6 CE by the Romans, and it was due to the overthrow of the client king Herod's son Archelaus. And at that point, Judea becomes part of the Roman Syrian province, and it stays that during the life of Jesus. And then basically they are under the rule of a Roman prefect, which in Jesus' case here becomes Pontius Pilate, and we'll say a little bit more about that. So Herod's successors inherited the same name Herod, and consequently in the New Testament many people are called Herod, but we need to make these distinctions. For our series here, we're going to call Herod the Great Herod, and every other Herod by their actual name. But for us, of most concern, of course, is Antipas, the king of Galilee. Now, in Jesus' day, which is about 4 BCE to 30 CE, Antipas governed Galilee on the same terms as his father Herod the Great. He paid tribute, he cooperated with Rome, and he maintained public order. In return, Rome would protect him against invasion, not by stationing groups necessarily. Now, but by the implied threat, not by stationing groups, but by the implied threat of retaliation against any potential invaders. Antipas could do as he willed. He even minted coins once, which is a real sign of independence. And this is all important for the life of Jesus. This was not Roman territory. Galilee was not Roman territory per se. They had a king, Antipas, minted his own coins and ran his own house. Now, Antipas was fairly observant to Jewish law, and there's no real indication that he tried to impose Hellenization or Greco-Roman customs on his Jewish population. In the small towns and villages, the institutions of Galilee was thoroughly Jewish. Schools were Jewish, Jewish magistrates, judges, cases according to the Jewish law. Antipas was a good tetrarch and adequately fulfilled the conditions of successful rule, and Rome didn't need to intervene. So this is the climate in Galilee during the time of Jesus. Now, during the Jewish revolt against Rome, this is in 66 AD or CE, a Jewish mob destroyed his palace because he decorated it with figures of animals, and some interpreted that as being against the law. No figures on heaven or earth if you read the Ten Commandments properly. But other than this, Antipas had a good rule and a good life in Galilee. Now, his brother Archelaus in Judea did not fare the same, and this is very important for the life of Jesus. Right, okay, let's just back to Antipas again. Antipas did commit, however, one major blunder, and this is when he became entranced with Herodias, his half-niece, who was already married to one of our uncles. Uncles and niece marriages were okay at this time. But he sent to plan his own wife away so he could be with her. Long story short, his wife's father was an Arab king. He reacts and inflicts a massive defeat on Antipas. Both the New Testament and Josephus connects this account to John the Baptist. In Mark, John the Baptist openly criticizes Antipas for this, and it leads to his execution, John's execution. According to Josephus, Antipas was afraid of John, who had a large following. This is all very, very important, who could incite a revolt. And so Antipas had John the Baptist executed. In 39 CE, Herodias, her ambition, the new wife of Antipas, led him to Rome to request a promotion from tetrarch to king. Not a good move. Found guilty of storing arms, deposed and went into exile. Now, let's look at Judea in the time of Jesus, and then we'll end this session. Judea consisted of, as we've said, Samaria, Judea, which includes Jerusalem, the capital, and Idumea. Now, this part of Palestine was much harder to govern than Galilee. Herod had executed 2 popular teachers and appointed an unpopular high priest near the end of his life. There was a great deal of hostility between Jews and Samaritans, who were both within this area. The Jews were sensitive about what happened in the Jerusalem and specifically within the temple. And large public gatherings and festivals created an environment in which riots could very easily erupt. And there was always this impending threat of a riot. When Augustus deposed Archelaus in 6 CE, he chose to appoint a Roman governor, a prefect, and include Judea into the Syrian province of the Roman Empire. The prefect lived in Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast. He was not stationed in Jerusalem. He had to his disposal about 3,000 troops, which really wasn't a lot. And then he had a small garrison in the Antonia fortress in Jerusalem. But Rome did not actually govern Judea on a day-to-day basis. Towns and villages, once again, were governed by elders. Substantial upheavals required the intervention of the Syrian Roman legate, which was way superior to the Judean prefect, and they had around 25,000 troops to their disposal. With one exception, only the Roman prefect had the right to sentence anyone to death. So it's very important for our story. Nobody could sentence anyone to death. The high priest did not have the power to sentence anyone to death, except if a Gentile transgressed the courts of the temple. That person could be subject to immediate execution, and that would possibly would just have been stoning. But under the prefects, local government was in the hands of the citizens. But Jerusalem was governed by the high priest and his council. This is important for 3 reasons. Government by the high priest was traditional, right? No king. Jews held the office in high reverence. He was the official spokesperson for the people of Jerusalem, reporting to the Roman prefect. So Herod, and then later Rome, held the priest vestments. This I didn't know. And they only released the priest vestments on special occasions. With them on, the priest wielded way too much authority. The high priest at the time of Jesus was Joseph Caiaphas, and we'll meet him again. And he ruled for 17 years, which was longer than any other high priest under Roman rule. 10 of these years, Pontius Pilate was the prefect of Rome over Judea, which means that they, for 10 years, worked together seemingly quite well. It is a misnomer that Jesus lived in a context in which the population was under daily oppression by Roman soldiers and officials. In Galilee, there was no Roman official presence at all. In Galilee, there was only one Gentile city, Scythopolis, but it was politically independent from Galilee. In Judea, the Roman presence was very small because the prefect and most of his guards lived in Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast, and they seldom came to Jerusalem. Roman soldiers were not patrolling the towns and villages of Palestine. Effective rule was in the hands of the local elders and the aristocrats. Besides the outbreaks of violence at the death of Herod, Judea quieted down. But after Jesus, prophets also arose proclaiming a promised deliverance. The most prominent of these, we'll look at later, is Theudas and the Egyptian. Some notes in summary to end off our session today. Rome did not actually govern Palestine on a day-to-day basis. Antipas, the client king of Galilee, was semi-independent during the life of Jesus. In the 20s and the 30s, Judea and Jerusalem was under the Roman imperial system, a prefect. The day-to-day control of Jerusalem was in the hands of the high priest and his council, and they reported to the Roman prefect. Jewish Palestine was not on the edge of revolt when Jesus was executed. Despite a lack of major violence, there was always the possibility of insurrection or revolt especially during the times of festival in Jerusalem, because of so many Jews that would come to Jerusalem. Lastly, many Jews did want freedom from Roman suzerainty, and they thought this could be attained with God's help and without an actual war. Um, the exception here, of course, is the Dead Sea Scroll group, but most Jews wanted freedom from Rome, but believed that God was going to help them do that. They were not actually wanting to go to war with the massive Roman Empire. So this is all I leave you with today in this first session. In our next session, we'll be looking at, let me just have a quick look. We'll move on to Judaism as a religion and what it was like during that time. And then we're going to have a look at some of the external sources. That's very important when we're trying to establish the validity of the life of Jesus, his teachings, and what he has done. We also need some external sources, because if it's all just internal sources, it lacks credibility. So we're going to have a look at the external sources, and then we want to get to one of our main things, and this is the problems with the primary sources, which is our Gospels. Thank you so much for being with me today. I'll see you next time. Cheers.